You're now listening to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, the ultimate insider's guide for all things ocean shipping. Presented by NYFI.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Supply Chain Secrets Podcast. I'm your co-host, Caroline Weaver, and with me is Lars Jensen. Lars, looks like you're calling back from home.
Indeed, I am, at least for a few brief days, back in my home office here outside Copenhagen.
Well, welcome back home. I hope it's nice and restful for you before your next adventure.
Oh, yes.
All right, we got some good stuff to talk about today. I think we should kick it off with rates. Let's talk about TPEB rates.
Yeah, TPEB rates, the interesting part is there's not really much happening if we look at the rates from Shanghai specifically into the US West Coast, showing two different perspectives here. One is the orange one, that's the SCFI, which I think most people are familiar with, and that measures rates that are quoted. And then we have the blue line, which is the NYFI, which are spot rates solely for cargo that was actually not only booked, but is now also physically loaded on board the ships. And as I think we have discussed also a couple of months ago when we were talking the difference between SCFI and NYFI, then obviously NYFI will always come with a time delay because it takes time from the point where rates are first just quoted until somebody actually books against those quotes. Then they pick up the empty, then they fill the cargo in, then they go down and gate it in, and then it gets loaded. So if we offset it, it typically takes 3 weeks, we can see. So if we actually shift the quoted rates by 3 weeks, we get the next graph where we can see more clearly what's going on. This is what we get. So as we talked about a month ago, when we had this very brief but very, very intense freight rate spike on the Trans-Pacific, the SCFI significantly overshot what we then subsequently saw people actually paid for spot rates. There's a difference of roughly about $1,000 per 40-footer. That indicated to us at the time that the market was not as strong as everybody thought. Because keep in mind, when a carrier is making a quote into the market, they make a quote today, for example, that is based on the assessment of how strong do we think the market is today. But we don't actually know. It's only later on we'll find out how strong is the market, because I can, of course, launch a high quote. If the market is strong, shippers will book at that quote and they'll move the cargo. But if the market is factually not as strong as we think, I will not get many bookings at that high quote. And if I do, some shippers are going to renege on those ones and instead book at a lower rate, say a few days or a week later. And that's exactly what happened during this peak, where we can see quoted rates were actually much higher than what effectively ended up. Sure, everybody that moved spot certainly did pay a substantial premium, but it was relatively short-lived. If we then fast forward to the latest measurement, which came out here on Friday, August 1st, both lines here we can see are now more or less flatlining. It seems to show that the market has mellowed out to some degree. We are back to more or less the same balance we had before a lot of the hoo-ha we had with the short spike. Does this mean that the market will then stay stable for the foreseeable future? That is not necessarily a guarantee. What you cannot see on this graph is that the carriers are, this is also down to how you have to operate as a carrier. They are pre-advising rate increases, either as DRIs or peak season surcharges. And on July 1st, a range of carriers had actually announced rate increases between $1,000 and $3,000 per 40-foot. Well, as we can see in the graph, that absolutely didn't happen. Rates went down. On July 15th, the same carriers had announced rate increases between $1,000 and $3,000. Well, July 15th, we can certainly see that did not happen either. As per August 1st, the same carriers had announced rate increases between $1,000 and $3,000, which again really didn't materialize. As far as I can see, they haven't quite announced the same going further into August. So for now, it seems rates are to some degree flatlining. That's not just the US West Coast. If we look at the last graph of the day, we can see more or less the same pattern also unfold here. For the US East Coast, there's slightly more of a time lag. In this case, we've also offset 3 weeks like we did with the West Coast. In reality, it turns out there might be a 4-week time lag. So the timing from when you see quotes until it's acted upon, there seems to be a slight logistical difference in practical operational terms for cargo going either to West or East Coast. But in both cases, we see freight rates that are somewhat mellowing out at the levels we're at now. What will then happen going forward? That depends to a significant degree on what we might see happen on the whole tariff landscape. But before we go to that whole debacle, it might be worthwhile maybe just have a look at the Asia-Europe, because we tend to be focused quite a lot sometimes on the trans-Pacific trade, especially given the whole tariff hoo-ha coming out of the US. But if we look at Asia-Europe, for Asia-Europe, we are smack in the middle of the traditional peak season. There is indeed a peak season. Demand has been strong in peak season over the past month or so. Rates are holding firm at relatively solid levels as well. How do I assess that they are solid? Well, of course, it depends a little bit on what we're looking at. Peak spot rates going into Europe right now are, at least if we judge from, say, the WCI index, they're about $3,000 to $3,500 per FFE. That's a lot less than what we saw last year. Last year, we were up to 7, 8, 9,000, but that was, of course, immediately in the wake of all the Red Sea turmoil. So last year is a poor comparison. We can then compare to 2023. Right now, rate levels are more than twice what they were in 2023, but you can also argue 23 is a poor comparison point because this is where we had massive overcapacity. Rates were reaching loss-making levels. So what's the right comparison? We could go even further back and say, let's forget all of the developments from 2020 onwards. And what about the so-called stable period before? In that case, the spot rate levels we're seeing on Asia-Europe now in peak season, if I compare to peak season all the previous years, we have to go way back to 2012 to find rate levels in peak season matching what we're seeing now. So whereas there are clearly issues on the Trans-Pacific and on the US trades, peak season is doing just fine on the Asia-Europe trade. And right now there are no signs of an imminent end to that one.
What was going on in 2012? Was it like everything was copacetic?
No, that was actually in a tumultuous period as well. Remember, in 2009, everything crashed because of the global financial crisis. Then in 2010, the market came roaring back because we came out of the financial crisis. A lot of ships had been put in cold layup, so they were lying in Scottish fjords and whatever. So when demand suddenly came back, the ships took time to reactivate. And once the ships got reactivated, all the empty containers were in the wrong locations. This sounds very much like also the aftermath after the pandemic. It's exactly the same. Yeah. So you had a huge spike in rates in 2010. When the carriers then started to put in all the capacity, they decided to launch themselves into an extremely destructive freight rate war. So everything collapsed again in 2011 because of a freight rate war. The freight rate war was then called off in 2012 and we got another rebound up. So that period was also extremely unstable. Not with extremes as we saw during the pandemic, but prior to that, it was one of the most extreme periods we had actually seen. Back to the starting point here, Asia-Europe is actually strong, holding up nicely for peak season as we see it right now.
That's good. Nice little history lesson for the listeners as well. All right, shall we move on to tariff updates? We did finally get some clarity over the week.
I'm not sure I would use the word clarity, but we got some new information. I would rather put it that way. And let me break it down why I say we got some more information and not necessarily clarity. If we start with all the so-called reciprocal tariffs, these are the ones where, and I've mentioned that the last couple of weeks in the podcast as well, up until basically back on Friday, all of these letters that have been sent to various countries what their new tariffs should be, they were just letters. They had no legal basis at that point in time. That was then changed when I think it was Thursday evening. With executive orders now coming out with what are the new levels. So now they are actually the levels. A lot of countries have gotten away with the 10%, and then we have a whole range of countries that are anywhere ranging up to 41%. I'm not going to waffle on about the logic or lack thereof on which countries got which degrees of a tariff. Some of these are linked to the so-called trade deals. Some of them are not. The country that got the highest tariff was Syria, which, okay, I mean, you can put a high level of tariff on Syria. I'm pretty sure there's not much cargo being imported into the U.S. from Syria anyhow. But at least we know what these tariff levels are. It was also stated that these come into effect as of August 8th. That also means, at least from a shipment perspective, you need to have your cargo loaded on port, the final mode of transportation. So make sure you're not going to be transshipped. final mode of transportation before that. And that also means from a practical purpose, that game is already up.
Right.
If you have, you cannot realistically go out and book a container today and expect to pick up the empty, load the container, gate it into the port, and be sure that container is physically on board a ship before the clock strikes midnight here between Thursday and Friday. That is unrealistic.
Well, maybe there's a price, but you might as well just be paying the tariff at that point.
Yeah, exactly. So you would say to some degree there is clarity on that part. The reason why I say to some degree is it also appears to me that a lot of shippers are viewing this the same way as they did it back on Liberation Day. Sure, all these tariffs have now been put on. Let's wait a few days and see if we get another pause. And at least given the prehistory here over the last 4 months of the trade war, there is certainly merit to the argument because we have seen that time and time again. So I would expect most shippers from all the countries, especially ones with the higher reciprocal tariffs, that they would simply sit on whatever cargo they have and at least wait, say, a week, maybe even 2 weeks before deciding whether it's worthwhile shipping it or not. But that doesn't cover all trades in the world. Obviously, China is not part of this whole package. China has a different deadline. That is on August 12th. And barring any new pause or any new agreements, we will revert back to 145% tariff on China imports to the US. And it would then be exceedingly likely that China would revert back to then putting 125% tariff on US imports into China, which, as we also saw back in spring, is extremely devastating to especially US agricultural exporters if that was to happen. And I say if, because yes, the pause right now is per executive order running to August 12th. Last week, there was trade negotiations between US and China in Sweden. And in the subsequent press conference, you had the US Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, was basically saying that China had also agreed to an extension of the tariff pause. However, in Scott Bessent's own words, that needed to be agreed to by Trump. And 6 days ago, his statement was literally that they would discuss this with Trump tomorrow. That is 5 days ago, and there is still no new information in terms of a pause or not. So whether we get back up to 145% and 125 on imports to China 8 days from now, or whether it gets postponed, is basically anyone's guess. We don't know.
Definitely not worth banking on.
No, at least it's difficult to bet the farm on it. Mexico just got theirs postponed another 90 days. So postponements absolutely do happen. Whereas Canada did not get a postponement. Instead, they get a tariff increase from 20 to 35%. Given that the 25% and now also the 35% is not on all goods from Canada, the ones that are included in the US-Canada-Mexico trade agreement are exempt from these tariffs just to make life even more complicated.
What are the types of goods that are covered by that?
There is a lot of the different goods. I was about to say autos, but they are part of a separate whole package of tariffs, auto and auto parts. I believe issues such as, for example, Canadian lumber and some of those are some of the larger elements that are being impacted by this. There was a study from, I can't remember which one of the financial institutions last week, looking at the impact some of these tariffs would have on homes in the U.S. Because when you're building new homes, you are relying a lot also on imported products. That could be cement. You're using a lot of steel, for example, in construction of houses. And Canada accounts for, I believe, it's about 25% of the lumber used in the U.S. Their assessment was that the tariffs alone would likely increase the price of an average new built house by about $10,000 alone.
Oh, wow,
so
yeah.
It's not insignificant, the impact on this. And I think this is also why a lot of importers right now are still playing the wait-and-see game. Because if we think back to what happened in early April, everyone thought that these tariffs would be implemented immediately. And the economic ramifications of those were so severe that the financial markets reacted very strongly. And that then led to the pause. This time around, it appears most of the financial markets are expecting new pauses to come in, which means they haven't reacted. If it's that reaction that's causing the pause, then we're not going to get the pause until somebody really feels the pain from these tariffs that are coming in. So rather than back on Liberation Day where the pause came after, I think it was 36 or 48 hours, it could be maybe a few weeks this time around before we get the pause. And that's leads to also what's then going to happen with the U.S. peak season. We discussed it also here on the podcast last week, and I actually think the week before. And the longer we sit here and watch it, the higher the likelihood that we're going to see another one of these dramatic spikes that we also saw here in May, early June. Because if the U.S. importers are still doing wait and see to see if they get a pause on the tariffs, they are likely getting product made in China because it physically has to be made. And if we then get, let's say hypothetically, a pause on some of these tariffs, and that pause starts, say, 2 weeks from now, that leaves a relatively short period to get the cargo moved if you want to make sure they reach the shelves by the holiday sales. Because in this case, I mean, for China specifically, there's the golden week. But for the other countries, the hard deadline the importers are up against are, of course, how late in the game can you wait until you're going to miss out on your holiday sales. So you can't wait forever, so to speak. And the longer we wait, the higher the likelihood we're going to see another one of these mini spikes. And the challenge with that mini spike, as we also saw amply demonstrated in April, June, demand can change rapidly. But no matter how much they want to ramp up capacity rapidly, it just physically takes time to move ships around. So the carriers cannot physically react instantaneously. So there'll be a lag of a couple of weeks, again causing a stampede for the few slots that are actually available on the ships.
Yeah, so now you're making a decision of if you want to be competing with the other shippers that might also be trying to use this wait-and-see strategy, you could end up not being able to make the boat.
Yeah, exactly. So it's not an envious position to be in, to be a U.S. importer these days.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Anything else on tariffs, or should we move on?
No, I think that's about where we are on the tariffs as it is right now. I don't know what's going to happen, but if I was to lean out at least with one forecast, I would have at least call it an expectation / hope that when we talk here a week from now, that there's likely going to be a pause on the China tariffs. I don't see the baseline scenario being a reversal back to the 145 and 125% mutual tariffs. But we'll have to wait and see.
All right. Place your wagers now on what we think will happen. All right. Awesome. Let's switch gears a little bit. So the IMF issued a update to their April numbers. Let's spend some time talking about that and what that means.
Yeah. I mean, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, usually provides economic forecasts and updates for the global outlook every quarter, and they adjust it every quarter as well. And if we look at the adjustments, they came out here in terms of their forecasts for 2025-26. If you only look at the headline numbers, what you will find is that they have increased their growth expectations for 25 and 26 compared to 3 months ago. And this is where I want to make a separate point. When you look at all of these different economic news that are being thrown at us all the time, we need to make sure we understand the context of what we're talking about. Because if we only look and say, well, IMF increased the trade outlook, there might be those that are tempted to say, well, look, tariffs are not that bad. Because, well, the tariffs came back in and IMF just updated their trade outlook. All is good. But let's be clear here. The increase in the outlook is compared to the forecast they made 3 months ago. And 3 months ago, they reduced their forecast quite a bit. The reason they reduced the forecast 3 months ago was because that's when we had just heard the announcement of all the reciprocal tariffs. So the expectation 3 months ago was an implementation of the reciprocals. As we now know, the reciprocals were largely not implemented. They were put on pause. And since the IMF economists spent more than just half an afternoon doing their analysis and doing the update, this analysis has been done prior to the new round of tariffs that are now coming in. So you can see how we're always, say, a step or two behind. So, of course, yes, in isolation, it's nice to say that the world is not going to crash, because it absolutely is not. But this increase in global economic growth is not because the global economy is doing well. It's just not doing as poorly as what was feared 3 months ago. If we go away from global economic growth and look at their expectations for world trade, they call it world trade volume, and they lump in both goods and services. Given we're obviously not moving services inside the containers, we should more take it with a grain of salt. But their current expectations is that world trade will grow 2.6% this year, and it will slow down to 1.9% growth next year. To put that in context, trade growth last year was 3.5%. So here they're clearly expecting a reduction in world trade from 3.5% last year, 2.6% this year, to 1.9% next year. That is not necessarily an optimistic outlook. But again, this is goods and services. It's all combined, but it does show an overall direction.
Is there a threshold where the growth percentage is so low that it's troublesome? I imagine it's not just zero. You probably get to a point maybe at between like 1% and 2% where alarms kind of start going off.
You can say that's where it would depend on what are the specific trades, what are the specific goods. Are we talking about containerized goods? Are we talking bulk goods? Are we talking services? If we think in terms of, for example, container demand, one way to think about it is in a normal year, a baseline assumption, roughly, should be around 3% global demand growth in container volumes. If we look at the next few years ahead of us, let's forget the fact that we have an underlying overcapacity that's been absorbed by the Red Sea. I think we have flogged that dead horse quite a number of times over the podcast, so let's park that one for a second. And if we look ahead and say, well, most of the coming years, we are looking roughly at 5% growth in capacity. That sounds bad if I'm also telling you that normal demand growth is around 3%. But here's the thing everybody should also be aware of. If we look at the 15 years before the pandemic, so in a more normal time scale, usually global capacity did tend to grow a bit more than 2 percentage points faster than demand. So actually a 3% demand growth should be met with a 5% growth in global fleet capacity. For those who think this sounds extremely odd, how can that be? Because for 15 years, that was indeed the case. There are a couple of reasons. First of all, ships have systematically been going slower. Last year was a bit of an aberration because we had to speed up around Africa. But on a sustained basis, ships are going slower. Basically 2 reasons. The most important reason is it saves money. The other one is it reduces emissions, which is, in my slightly cynical view, not the core driver for why shipping lines have been slowing down over 15 years. It is to save money, but it is a very valid consequence of it as well. Let's be honest about that. And there's no reason to suspect that trend would stop, especially not with the increased focus on emissions reductions. And ships, as they get larger, also tend to spend more time in port. It takes more time to handle a large ship than a small ship. So suddenly I need more ships to maintain a weekly schedule. These are structural factors that are still very much at play. So if we look at the years ahead with a rough benchline of 3% demand growth and 5% capacity injection, that's actually fairly well balanced. That's not where the problem is with overcapacity. The problem is with the overcapacity that we already have, but which is right now being contained because of the Red Sea crisis.
All right. Was there anything more you wanted to talk about with the IMF and their reports?
No, I think that's it for now. I just wanted to make that point also again in terms of keep in mind whenever we see economic reports that they are always time lagged. They always have to be interpreted and understood in the time frame within which they're actually done and measured.
Yes. Super important when you're trying to take insights out of the data that's being released. All right. The last thing we have on the docket today is the sanctions that OFAC issued on mainly Sealead being impacted. Do you want to talk more about this?
OFAC is, of course, the agency in the U.S. that basically manages U.S. sanctions around the world. That can be sanctions on nation states like there are on North Korea, on Iran, a number of countries. Sometimes there are sanctions on individual companies. Sometimes there are sanctions on individual persons. That can be because those are deemed to be involved in, for example, terrorist activities or activities that the U.S. really want for political reasons not to have anything to do with and penalize companies from dealing with. This has been basically part and parcel for also global shipping for decades and decades. And some shipping lines had to choose, do you want to service, for example, North Korea, or do you want to service something else, to make a ridiculous example? That's not really new. The reason why the one this time around was interesting is they were targeting some supply chain affiliated networks around a few Iranian nationals. I think part of the reason is that they feel that some of these networks are aiding and abetting also shipment services to, for example, the Houthis. So from that perspective, it's understandable why they want to crack down on some of these networks. What is interesting, though, is it's the first time, at least I can recall, that a sizable amount of container ships are suddenly impacted by this. Usually on the OFAC list, you will see names of companies, names of people. There's also in the past been specific named ships, but they tend to be general purpose ships or oil tankers or bulkers. But this time around, there were 22 specifically named container ships, which in essence means that if you as a shipping line are using these ships, you're going to be in trouble with anything to do with the US. And if you have other customers that are dealing with the US, they might shun you also. So it is a significant problem. And if you look at these 22 vessels, 16 of those were on charter by Sea Lead Shipping, which at the time when this was announced was the world's 13th largest container line. Sea Lead Shipping very quickly then went out and said, well, they have terminated all of those charters immediately. It's important to note here, Sea Lead was chartering these vessels. They don't own them, so they terminated the charters. The problem, of course, then becomes an operational one, because this accounts for around 37% of the total operated fleet of Sea Lead Shipping. They are likely going to be active in the market trying to charter other vessels. But until that happens, of course, there's going to be significant disruptions in the network that they are operating in, to the detriment of shippers on their ships, and of course to the competitive advantage of some of Sea Lead Shipping's competitors in the region. For those ones wondering, well, I said 22 ships and Sea Lead only had 16. What about the remaining 6? The remaining 6 were on charter to a Chinese company, Vux Shipping, that as far as I know is primarily focused on, for example, services between China and Russia. So I think they might be less inclined to care about whether they're on the OFAC list or not, but that remains to be seen. But the reason I want to flag it is I think it's... At least my memory might be faulty here, but I can't recall at least container shipping specifically be as impacted as it was this time around.
Yeah, it's kind of a fascinating scenario. So when the sanctions were first issued, do those ships essentially just need to halt at whatever port is closest to them and then they get rid of the cargo on board?
This is one of the very good questions which I actually don't have an actual answer to. Because, yes, there's of course cargo on board these ships. So who is now responsible for moving the ships to port, discharging them and moving them onwards? I'm pretty sure there's a lot of lawyers involved on a number of the shippers' side to figure out how do we deal with this practical situation that just arose.
Good day to be a maritime lawyer, I think. All right. Well, as we learn more about that situation, we can update our listeners here. We did have one question here from our listener that I wanted to talk about. So, hi, Lars. The inventory levels in the U.S. are forecasted to be at the same level as last year, July. How likely is it then that there will be a short demand spike, or has the front loading with the short spike we saw in June after the last tariff pause absorbed a majority of that demand?
Yeah, the challenge when you look at also inventories, they are basically stagnating, trending slightly down here in recent months. When you're looking at the data, they usually come out in the middle of the month. So that was mid-July data, unfortunately covering all the way back in June. Again, this is the lag data. I would still expect you to see a spike simply because this is where you do get that spike. You always get it, even so if inventory levels are the same as previous years, yes, you still get the spike because that is the cargo you need to move into the stores down the line. The argument for why you might not have a spike, that would have been if the inventories already now, again on a seasonally corrected level, if inventories right now were larger than what they were last year. But that does not really appear to be materially the case.
Okay. Well, thank you for asking the question. And I think that's everything that we had for today. Any final thoughts?
No, I think we as usual, heading into interesting times. We need to continue to watch what is happening on the whole tariff landscape. Of course, we have the deadline of August 8th and August 12th coming up. I think that's what most people will be focused on, how those ones are going to pan out. And then we should keep our eyes out on the Asia-Europe trade to see how long the peak season is continuing, because as everything else, peak season doesn't last forever. So it's likely going to peter out here within the next, say, 2 to 4 weeks or so.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're on Apple Music, Spotify, even on YouTube. And we'll be back here next week talking about the latest in the supply chain news. So until then, have a great one.
Thanks for listening to Supply Chain Secrets Podcast, presented by NYFI. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Want to be a part of the show? Register to attend a live recording at the link below.